Real intelligence doesn't show up when you speak. It shows up when you decide. It shows up in what you tolerate, in what you choose to ignore, in what you do when no one is watching and there's nothing to prove. Most people spend their entire lives performing intelligence, dropping names, citing statistics, jumping into conversations just to be heard, without ever developing the kind of thinking that actually changes outcomes. There are people in every office, every neighborhood, every social circle who don't seem particularly impressive on the surface. They don't quote books in every conversation. They don't try to dominate meetings with the loudest opinion. They don't rush to respond when someone challenges them. And yet, these are the people who end up advancing faster, earning more, making fewer catastrophic mistakes, and moving through life with a kind of quiet confidence that others can't quite explain. They're not smarter because they know more. They're smarter because they think differently at the exact moments when everyone else reacts the same way. For a long time, most of us were sold a version of intelligence that had almost nothing to do with real life. We were told that intelligence meant scoring high on tests, memorizing vast amounts of information, appearing sharp in conversations, or having the fastest answer in the room. Schools rewarded the students who could recall the most facts. Workplaces promoted the people who spoke most confidently. Social circles respected those who could argue the best points. And so we learned, deeply and unconsciously, that intelligence was a performance. But the intelligence that actually changes the trajectory of a life doesn't live in your head. It lives in your behavior. It lives in how you read other people before they reveal themselves. It lives in how you interpret a situation before everyone else has decided what it means. It lives in how you make decisions under real pressure when the outcome is uncertain and the stakes are high. It lives in how you act when there are no guarantees, no applause, and no one to validate your choice. That's where the gap opens up. That's where the people who simply repeat old patterns get separated from the people who create lasting advantage. This audiobook was built to train that kind of intelligence, practical, quiet, and deeply effective. The kind of intelligence that doesn't need approval from the room. The kind that doesn't exhaust itself arguing over things that don't matter. The kind that refuses to play games designed to waste time and energy. The kind that, to outside observers, always seems to be one step ahead, not because it's moving faster, but because it's thinking more clearly. This is not a book about theory. You won't find abstract philosophy here, or ideas that only work in ideal conditions. What you'll find is a way of operating in real life, in relationships that frustrate you, in decisions that paralyze you, in conflicts that drain you, in opportunities you keep missing, and in the quiet personal power that most people sense they have, but never quite learn to access. If you've ever sat in a meeting and watched someone else get credit for an idea you suggested 20 minutes earlier and wondered why no one seemed to notice, this book is for you. If you've ever felt like the most thoughtful person in the conversation, but somehow the least heard, this book is for you. If you know, somewhere deep down, that your problem isn't a lack of talent or intelligence, but a lack of the right mental framework, this book is for you. Because when you truly understand how real intelligence works, you don't need to run harder or talk louder. Life starts responding differently, and that difference begins right now, in the first chapter. Chapter 1. Think before you react. The skill that separates the respected from the overlooked. Here is something almost no one tells you about why certain people get ignored. Even smart, capable, well-meaning people who genuinely have good ideas and solid experience. It's not that they lack intelligence. It's that they react. The moment something happens, a challenge, a criticism, a provocative comment in a meeting, a text message that rubs them the wrong way, they respond immediately. They defend. They explain. They justify. They counter. And in doing so, they hand over something they didn't even realize they had: control. Most people believe that reacting quickly is a sign of intelligence. That sharp, fast responses prove you're engaged, capable, and confident. But in real life, in the office, in difficult conversations, in negotiations, in the social dynamics that determine who gets respected and who gets dismissed, the opposite is almost always true. The person who reacts first nearly always loses the advantage. Because reactions are born from impulse, not from judgment. And impulse is emotional territory, not intellectual territory. Think about the last time you said something in the heat of the moment that you immediately regretted. Maybe it was a defensive comment in a meeting when your idea was challenged. Maybe it was a frustrated reply to a colleague's email. Maybe it was something you said in a personal conversation that came out sharper than you intended, and you could see the other person's expression shift, and you knew, even as the words were leaving your mouth, that you were making it worse. That moment of knowing and still not stopping, that's the gap between impulsive reaction and intelligent response. And closing that gap is one of the highest leverage things you can do for every area of your life. Reacting without thinking has an invisible cost that most people never fully calculate. It's not just the immediate fallout, the awkward moment, the defensive argument, the missed opportunity. It's cumulative. Every time you react impulsively, you reinforce a neural pattern. Your brain learns that this is how you handle pressure. And over time, that pattern becomes your reputation. People start to predict you. They know that if they push this button, you'll react this way. And once people can predict your reactions, they can manage you, whether they consciously intend to or not. Brilliant people lose respect, damage professional relationships, miss business opportunities, and undermine their own credibility, not because they lack knowledge or skill, but because they haven't learned to pause. Not for lack of capacity, but for lack of that 3 to 5 second window between stimulus and response. The intelligent mind doesn't rush. It observes. It evaluates. It chooses the moment to act, and sometimes chooses not to act at all, because it understands something that most people never learn. The first reaction is almost never the best decision. Consider what happens at the highest levels of professional chess. This is an environment where intelligence is not in question. Every player at the elite level is operating at an extraordinary cognitive level. And yet the great masters don't play fast, even when they already know the move. They stop. They look at the entire board. They trace consequences 3, 4, 5 moves ahead. Not because they don't know the answer, but because they understand that the error never comes from not knowing. It comes from moving too soon. Garry Kasparov, arguably the greatest chess player in history and a man who spent decades studying how elite minds work under pressure, has spoken extensively about this exact dynamic. He observed that at the highest levels of competition, games are rarely won through genius. They're won because one player holds their composure while the other rushes under pressure. The intelligent player doesn't accelerate when tension rises. They decelerate. They slow everything down. And in that deliberate slowness, they find their advantage. This principle doesn't stay on the chessboard. It plays out in every high-stakes environment you'll ever encounter. Think about what happens when you're in a meeting and someone dismisses your idea or challenges your competence in front of others. There's an immediate physiological response. Your heart rate increases slightly, your jaw tightens, your mind floods with reactive thoughts. In that moment, you have two options. You can respond from that place, defending yourself, pushing back immediately, matching their energy, or you can pause. What most people don't realize is that the pause itself communicates something powerful. When you don't immediately react to a provocation, you signal something that no argument ever could, that you are not controlled by the moment, that you have something the other person is trying to get you to give away, your composure. And people who can't take your composure can't take your power. When someone pressures you, challenges you, or demands an immediate response, they are often, consciously or not, attempting to control the pace of the interaction. And whoever controls the pace usually controls the outcome. The intelligent response is to break that rhythm, create a pause, not to escape, but to think more clearly. That pause is a form of mental power that most people in the room have never even considered. Here's the practical application, and it is entirely trainable. Every time you feel the impulse to respond immediately to a pointed question in a meeting, to a passive-aggressive message, to a comment that gets under your skin, stop, breathe, count slowly to 5. Not to calm yourself down emotionally, though that may happen too, but specifically to recover cognitive control. That small space between the stimulus and your response is where practical intelligence lives. In that space, you get to decide, do I speak? How do I speak? Or do I say nothing at all? And here's something most people miss. Saying nothing is often the most powerful move available. Silence, in the right moment, is not weakness. It's mastery. You can train this in real situations starting today. When you receive an email that triggers frustration, don't respond for 30 minutes. When someone says something in a conversation that makes you want to defend yourself immediately, take one slow breath before you speak. When you're in a meeting and feel the pressure to fill silence with your voice, let the silence breathe for a moment first. At first, this will feel uncomfortable. You'll worry that people will think you have nothing to say or that you're backing down. But very quickly, you'll notice something remarkable. Fewer mistakes, fewer moments of regret, more respect from the people around you. Because there is nothing that communicates confidence and mental strength more clearly than a person who doesn't feel compelled to react to everything. And most importantly, a growing sense of internal control, because your mind has stopped chasing impulses and started directing them. The goal of this chapter is not to make you cold or emotionally unavailable. It's to make you clear. While others are losing their composure and explaining themselves to anyone who will listen, you're making choices. While others are reacting, you're deciding. And when you decide from a place of calm clarity, life starts to respond very differently. Now that you understand how to create a pause before you react, the next chapter will show you something even more powerful. Because it turns out that intelligence shows itself even more in what you choose to ignore than in what you know. And learning to direct your attention deliberately is one of the most quietly powerful things you can do for your mind. Chapter 2. Where you place your attention defines your intelligence. There's a question almost no one thinks to ask themselves, and it might be the single most important question for anyone who wants to think more clearly, decide more wisely, and stop feeling mentally exhausted at the end of every day. The question is not, how smart am I? The question is, what am I actually thinking about? Intelligence is not measured only by what you know. It's revealed, far more accurately, by what you choose to think about. Two people can have identical educational backgrounds, access to the same information, the same professional opportunities, and the same amount of time in a day, and still produce results that are worlds apart. The difference almost never comes down to raw intelligence. It comes down to something far more subtle and far more trainable, where they place their attention. The intelligent mind doesn't try to process everything. It learns, deliberately and without guilt, to ignore what doesn't matter. Not because it's lazy or checked out, but because it understands something that most people never grasp. Attention is a finite resource. And whatever absorbs your attention ends up shaping your thinking. The things you focus on don't just occupy your mind. They become your mind. They determine the quality of your decisions, the depth of your thinking, and the clarity of your judgment. Most people in modern life are operating with their attention held hostage. Not by enemies or obvious distractions, but by a constant, low-grade flood of things that feel important but aren't. News cycles designed to trigger emotional responses to events you have no power to influence. Social media feeds engineered to keep you comparing your behind-the-scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. Workplace politics that burn hours without producing anything meaningful. Conversations that drain energy without creating solutions. The opinions of people who aren't building anything worth imitating. This mental noise doesn't just exhaust you. It impoverishes your thinking. A mind that is constantly occupied with the irrelevant loses its depth. It becomes reactive instead of strategic. It becomes busy instead of effective. And perhaps most damaging of all, it becomes unable to see the opportunities that are sitting right in front of it. Not because those opportunities aren't there, but because the attention is always somewhere else. The truly intelligent person is not the one who knows the most. They are the one who chooses most carefully what to pay attention to. And that single choice, repeated daily, across hundreds of small decisions about where to direct mental energy, is what determines the quality of everything else. Consider the career arc of Matthew McConaughey. For most of the early 2000s, he was known primarily as the charming lead in romantic comedies. Commercially successful, personally wealthy, professionally comfortable. From the outside, Everything looked fine. But McConaughey recognized something that most people in his position never would have. That comfort was quietly eroding his potential. He was saying yes to everything that kept him visible, and in doing so, he was scattering his attention across projects that didn't challenge him or push his craft forward. What followed became one of the most remarkable deliberate reinventions in Hollywood history, what critics later called the McConaissance. He made a decision that most people in his position would have found terrifying. He stopped accepting the roles that came easily and abundantly, and he waited for over a year without income from acting for projects that would genuinely stretch him. Dallas Buyers Club, True Detective, Interstellar, The Lincoln Lawyer. These weren't just better films. They were the result of a man who had made a radical, disciplined choice about where to place his attention and what was worthy of it. When he accepted his Academy Award for Best Actor, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a sudden surge of talent. It was the result of sustained, selective attention, the decision to focus only on what elevated him, even when the easier path was right there. This plays out in ordinary life in ways that are just as significant, even if less visible. Think about the people you know who always seem mentally drained, but somehow never seem to be making real progress. They're not lazy. They're often working extremely hard, but their mental energy is going everywhere, into arguments about things they can't control, into comparing themselves to people they don't actually know, into consuming content that fills time without building anything, into replaying conversations and rehearsing responses to conflicts that will never actually happen. The mind doesn't get stronger through accumulation. It gets stronger through selection. Every mental yes is simultaneously a no to something else. Every hour you spend consuming content that doesn't improve your thinking, your decisions, or your relationships is an hour your mind didn't spend getting sharper. The math is simple, even if the discipline is hard. Here's the practical application. Over the next few days, don't try to overhaul your entire relationship with attention all at once. Instead, do something much simpler and far more powerful. Observe honestly where your attention actually goes. Not where you think it goes, or where you intend it to go, where it actually lands when you're not consciously directing it. The conversations you replay, the content you default to when you have 5 minutes of unstructured time, the worries you return to again and again, even though engaging with them has never once produced a solution. Once you've observed it honestly, make one single adjustment. Identify one source of mental noise, one recurring drain on your attention that produces nothing useful, no clarity, no solutions, no genuine connection, and remove it. Not everything at once, just one. That single removal will free up a quantity of mental energy that will surprise you. And when that attention is freed, your thinking improves almost immediately because the mind was always capable of more clarity. It just didn't have the space. Training attention isn't about forcing concentration through willpower. It's not about white-knuckling your way through distractions. It's about reducing the unnecessary inputs so that your natural intelligence has room to operate. The intelligent person doesn't fight their own mind. They design their mental environment. They decide what enters, what stays, and what gets discarded, not out of arrogance, but out of an understanding that the mind has limits, and those limits are best respected rather than ignored. That design process, quiet, personal, and entirely internal, is one of the most powerful forms of intellectual advantage available to anyone. While others are reacting to everything that crosses their path, you are choosing. And that choice, made consistently, creates a kind of mental clarity that looks, from the outside, like exceptional intelligence. The result of developing this skill is not just less mental fatigue, though you'll certainly feel that. It's a sharpness and precision in your thinking that changes how you show up in every conversation, every decision, and every challenge. Less noise, less confusion, more clarity. And when you operate with clarity, you start seeing opportunities that were always there, opportunities that you were simply too distracted to notice before. Chapter 3. Think in solutions, not in complaints. Here is a pattern that quietly determines more about a person's outcomes than almost anything else, and almost no one talks about it directly. It's not talent. It's not connections. It's not even work ethic, though work ethic matters enormously. The single biggest hidden differentiator between the people who keep advancing and the people who keep stalling is this: what their mind does when something goes wrong. Because things will go wrong. Constantly, unpredictably, and often unfairly. That's not pessimism. That's just an accurate description of how life and work and relationships actually function. The variable isn't whether obstacles appear. The variable is whether your mind instinctively moves towards solutions or instinctively reaches for complaint. Most people, when they hit an obstacle, do something that feels entirely natural and even socially rewarded. They describe the problem in detail. They explain what went wrong. They identify who or what is to blame. They find others who agree with their assessment. And in doing so, they receive an immediate emotional reward: the relief of being understood, the validation of having their frustration acknowledged, the temporary comfort of shared grievance. But that emotional reward has an invisible cost that compounds over time. Every complaint you make, even internally, even never said out loud, reinforces a specific neural pathway. It trains your brain to see the situation as something happening to you rather than something you can influence. And a mind that repeatedly practices helplessness becomes genuinely less capable of finding solutions. Not because the solutions aren't there, but because the mental habit of complaint has narrowed the field of what the brain is even looking for. The intellectually superior person doesn't deny problems. They aren't relentlessly positive in some performative way that ignores reality. What they do is something more disciplined and more effective. They refuse to let their mind stay in problem description mode. They understand that explaining a problem in detail is not the same as solving it. That spending significant time narrating what went wrong only strengthens the mental block. And so, when something fails, their first move is not verbal, it's cognitive. They change the question. Instead of "why is this happening to me?" they ask, "what can I adjust right now?" That small cognitive pivot changes everything that follows. Bethany Hamilton was 13 years old when a tiger shark attacked her while she was surfing off the coast of Hawaii, taking her left arm just below the shoulder. The world watched, expecting a story of tragedy and limitation. What happened instead became one of the most studied examples of resilient psychology in modern sports history. Hamilton did not spend her recovery in the narrative of what had been taken from her, though no one would have blamed her if she had. Instead, within weeks, she was asking a different question. Not, "how do I live with what happened?" but "how do I adapt my surfing technique to what I have now?" She worked with coaches to develop an entirely new paddling style. She modified her approach to waves, to board positioning, to the physical mechanics of competitive surfing. Less than a year after the attack, she was competing again. Within 2 years, she had won her first national title. Her advantage wasn't physical. By every objective measure, she was operating with a significant physical limitation that her competitors didn't have. Her advantage was entirely mental. The refusal to let her mind stay anchored in the description of the problem rather than the pursuit of the solution. While others might have remained in the story of the loss, she was already operating inside the logic of adaptation. This same dynamic plays out at a much smaller scale every single day in offices, homes, and social situations across America. Two people face the same professional setback. A project gets canceled, a promotion goes to someone else, a client relationship falls apart. One spends the next several weeks processing what went wrong, talking about it repeatedly, building a detailed and entirely accurate case for why the situation was unfair. The other spends that same time identifying one concrete action they can take, however small, that moves them in a better direction. At the end of those weeks, both people have experienced the same setback, but only one of them is in a different position than they were before. The one who moved? They didn't have better luck. They had a better mental habit. Here is the practical application, and it works immediately. The next time you catch a complaint forming in your mind, even before it becomes a spoken word, do one thing. Convert it into an action question. If the thought is "this project is a complete disaster," convert it to "what is one specific thing I can improve about this today?" If the thought is "nobody listens to my ideas in these meetings," Convert it to what is one thing I can change about how I present my ideas that is entirely within my control. Notice that this exercise doesn't erase the problem. It doesn't require you to pretend everything is fine or to perform optimism you don't feel. What it does is restore your sense of agency, your brain's ability to recognize that there is something you can do, even when the overall situation feels completely out of your hands. And that restoration of agency is applied intelligence. It is your mind working for you instead of against you. Thinking in solutions doesn't mean being an unrealistic optimist. It means being operationally effective. The intelligent mind doesn't prioritize feeling better first. It prioritizes functioning better. And almost without exception, when it starts functioning better, when it starts moving, adjusting, acting, the emotional relief follows naturally. It arrives as a byproduct of forward motion, not as a prerequisite for it. For anyone who has ever felt invisible in a room, whose ideas get dismissed, whose contributions go unacknowledged, whose voice doesn't seem to carry the weight it deserves, this chapter carries a particularly important message. Because the tendency, when you feel unheard, is to focus on the injustice of not being heard, to describe the problem to your friends, to your family, to yourself in increasing detail. And while that description is usually accurate, it is also completely useless as a strategy. The person who starts getting heard is not usually the one who complained most effectively about being ignored. It's the one who quietly asked, "What can I change about how I show up, how I communicate, how I position myself, that is entirely within my control?" and then started changing it. That question is not resignation. It's not giving up on the idea that the situation should be better. It's the recognition that the only lever you can actually pull is your own behavior. And pulling that lever consistently is what creates real change. Chapter 4. Choose who you listen to. There is a form of intelligence erosion that happens so gradually, so quietly, and so socially acceptably that most people never recognize it until years of confusion and second-guessing have already accumulated. It doesn't come from a lack of education. It doesn't come from laziness or poor decisions. It comes from something that gets praised as a virtue: listening to everyone. From the time we're children, we're taught that being open to other people's perspectives is a sign of maturity and good character. And in a genuine sense, it is. The ability to consider viewpoints other than your own is real intellectual strength. But there is a version of that principle that gets distorted in practice. A version where being open becomes giving equal weight to every opinion that enters your space, regardless of the source, the experience behind it, or the actual relevance it has to your life. And that distortion is quietly devastating. Here's what actually happens when you accept all opinions without filtering them. Every perspective you take in competes for space in your mental model of the world. Every voice that enters your decision-making process adds complexity, introduces doubt, and requires cognitive energy to process. When those voices come from people who have genuine experience, who have paid real costs for their decisions, and carry real consequences for their thinking, that complexity is valuable. It expands your understanding and sharpens your judgment. But when those voices come from people who have never actually done the thing they're opining about, who haven't taken the risk, who haven't built anything in that space, who are speaking from theory or anxiety or personal limitation rather than lived experience, then that complexity doesn't help you. It confuses you. It slows you down. It plants doubt where there should be clarity. And over time, listening to those voices doesn't make you more open-minded. It makes you less decisive, less confident, and less capable of trusting your own judgment. The mentally superior person understands something that takes most people decades to learn. Not all opinions are data. Many opinions are simply projections. They reflect the fears, the limitations, the unfulfilled ambitions, and the comfort zones of the person speaking. Not any objective truth about your situation, your capacity, or your potential. The intelligent approach is not to become dismissive or arrogant. It's not to stop listening to people. It's to develop a filter, a quiet, internal standard for deciding whose input actually deserves to shape your thinking and whose input deserves a polite acknowledgement and nothing more. Kobe Bryant built one of the most disciplined filtering systems in the history of professional sports, and it was a major factor in his dominance that often goes unexamined. Throughout his career, Bryant received an extraordinary volume of external input from coaches, teammates, media analysts, fans, critics, and former players with strong opinions about how he should play, lead, communicate, and evolve. The noise was constant and often intense. What made Bryant exceptional was not that he ignored feedback. It was that he had an extremely precise filter for which feedback actually deserved his attention. He listened deeply, obsessively, in fact, to a very small circle. Coaches who had worked with elite performers and could speak from that specific experience, teammates whose judgment he had personally tested under real pressure, and his own internal standards developed through years of deliberate practice. Everyone else received surface-level acknowledgement and nothing more. This wasn't arrogance. Bryant was famously coachable within his trusted circle. It was clarity. He understood that absorbing every external opinion would not make him more well-rounded. It would fragment his focus and introduce doubt into areas where he needed absolute conviction. The filtering wasn't about protecting his ego. It was about protecting the coherence of his thinking. The result wasn't isolation. It was one of the most sustained and dominant careers in NBA history, built not on natural talent alone, but on the kind of focused, coherent decision-making that only becomes possible when you stop letting every voice in the room compete for influence in your head. This plays out in the workplace in ways that are deeply relevant to anyone who has ever felt invisible or dismissed. When you're in a position where your ideas aren't being heard, where your contributions aren't being recognized, where your voice seems to carry less weight than you know it deserves, the social environment around that situation generates enormous amounts of opinion. Colleagues tell you what you should do differently. Friends tell you to just be more assertive. Family members give advice based on work environments from decades ago. Well-meaning people project their own fears onto your situation and call it wisdom. And if you absorb all of that without filtering, if you try to integrate every perspective into your understanding of what's happening and what to do about it, you will end up more confused, more paralyzed, and more stuck than you were before any of those conversations happened. Not because the people were malicious, but because their input was generated by their experience, not yours. Their limitations are not your limitations. Their ceilings are not your ceiling. And when you let their boundaries become your reference point, you've imported their constraints into your thinking. Here is the practical filter. 3 questions you can ask yourself internally before you allow any opinion to take up real estate in your mental model. First, has this person actually achieved what I'm trying to achieve, or something meaningfully comparable? Not adjacent to it, not aspirationally close to it. Actually done it, with real stakes and real consequences. Second, does this person live with the consequences of the kind of advice they're giving? Are they operating in the same reality they're describing, or are they advising from a safe distance? Third, does this person's actual life, not their words, their life, reflect clarity and direction, or does it reflect confusion and stagnation? If the answer to all 3 questions is yes, listen carefully. Take notes. Ask follow-up questions. This person has earned access to your decision-making process. If the answer to any of those questions is no, listen politely. Be genuinely respectful and warm. And then quietly do not incorporate what they said. Don't argue with it. Don't explain why you're not following it. Don't create a conflict that burns energy you need for something else. Simply filter it out and move on. That process, quiet, internal, and consistent, is not arrogance. It is mental hygiene. And practicing it saves you from years of unnecessary confusion, self-doubt, and decisions that were influenced by people who had no business influencing them. For the person who has spent years feeling like their voice doesn't carry weight in rooms that matter, this chapter offers something important. The first step to being heard by the right people is to stop being controlled by the wrong ones. When you spend enormous mental energy processing, managing, and responding to opinions from people who haven't earned that influence, you have less clarity, less confidence, and less of the quiet conviction that actually makes people listen. The filter isn't just about protecting yourself from bad advice. It's about preserving the quality of your own thinking so that when you speak from a place of genuine clarity rather than a mind cluttered with everyone else's limitations. When you reduce the wrong voices, your own judgment strengthens. Not because you became smarter overnight, but because the noise that was drowning out your own clarity has been reduced. And a mind operating with less noise is a mind that makes better decisions, communicates more precisely, and commands more respect without having to demand it. Chapter 5. Learn what's useful, not what's popular. We are living in the most information-rich environment in human history. At any moment, from any device, in any location, you can access more knowledge than any library in the world contained 50 years ago. The amount of content available for consumption, articles, videos, podcasts, courses, newsletters, books, posts, doubles faster than any individual can track. And yet, despite this unprecedented access to information, most people's ability to make good decisions hasn't improved proportionally. In many cases, it's gotten worse. More information hasn't produced more clarity. For most people, it's produced more noise, more confusion, more analysis paralysis, and a kind of low-grade cognitive exhaustion that comes from a mind that is always processing but never truly integrating. The reason is simple. Even if the solution requires real discipline, not all knowledge elevates intelligence. Most of it just occupies space. There is a crucial distinction that the truly intelligent person makes, one that most high consumers of information never even think to consider. The distinction between knowledge that is popular and knowledge that is useful. Popular knowledge is what's trending, what's being discussed, what's intellectually fashionable right now. It gives you things to say in conversations. It makes you seem informed and current. It generates likes and engagement when you share it. But it often produces almost nothing in terms of real-world outcomes. It doesn't improve your decisions. It doesn't change your behavior. It doesn't compound over time into genuine capability. Useful knowledge is different. It's the understanding that directly improves the quality of your choices in the situations you actually face. It's the insight that, when applied, changes what you do and therefore changes what you get. It may not be trendy. It may not be impressive at dinner parties, but it works. And over time, it compounds into a kind of practical wisdom that no amount of popular information consumption can replicate. Naval Ravikant, entrepreneur, investor, and one of the most thoughtful voices on the intersection of knowledge, decision-making, and personal effectiveness, has spoken extensively about this distinction. His approach to learning is deliberately and radically selective. Rather than trying to stay current across every domain or accumulating impressive breadth of reference, Ravikant focuses on what he calls foundational knowledge, a small set of core ideas from fields like mathematics, physics, economics, psychology, and decision theory that genuinely explain how the world works at a structural level. His reasoning is precise. If you understand a handful of fundamental principles deeply, you can derive most of what you need to know in any new situation. You don't need to have read everything. You need to have understood a few things completely. And those few things, applied consistently, produce better outcomes than a vast but shallow collection of interesting information. While others were chasing every new framework, every trending productivity system, every hot business book of the season, Ravikant was rereading the same foundational texts, going deeper rather than broader. His competitive advantage wasn't volume of knowledge. It was the quality and applicability of the knowledge he chose to internalize. This principle is directly relevant to anyone navigating a workplace or social environment where they feel overlooked or underestimated. There is a common instinct, when you feel like you're not being taken seriously, to compensate through volume, to learn more, read more, accumulate more credentials and references and talking points, so that eventually the sheer weight of what you know forces people to pay attention. And while some level of knowledge is always valuable, this instinct, when taken too far, produces the opposite of what's intended. It produces someone who is broadly informed but not deeply authoritative in anything. Someone who can discuss many topics but doesn't speak with the kind of focused conviction that makes people lean in and listen. The person who commands a room is rarely the one who knows the most about the most things. It's usually the one who knows something specific and applicable deeply, who speaks from genuine understanding rather than accumulated reference, and who can connect what they know to what actually matters in the current situation. Here's the practical application, and it requires a specific kind of honesty. Before you invest time in learning something new, whether it's a book, a course, a podcast series, or any other form of knowledge acquisition, ask yourself one brutally direct question. In what specific real situation would I actually use this in the next 30 days? Not, is this interesting? Not, would this make me sound smart if I brought it up? Not, is everyone else talking about this? The question is, will this change what I do in a situation I will actually face in the near future? If you can't answer that question with a specific scenario, that knowledge is not a current priority. It may be interesting. It may be valuable in some abstract sense. But your mental bandwidth is finite, and investing it in knowledge that won't translate into action is, in practical terms, a cost, because it displaces attention that could be going towards something that would actually move your life forward. Instead, identify the 3 to 5 domains that most directly impact your daily outcomes. For most people in professional environments, these include how to communicate ideas in a way that lands clearly and compellingly, how to make decisions under uncertainty without being paralyzed, how to manage attention and energy rather than just time, how to build credibility and trust systematically rather than accidentally, and how to navigate conflict without losing respect or creating enemies. These aren't glamorous topics. They don't generate viral content, but they are the areas where improvement produces the most immediate and compounding returns. And the person who chooses to go deep in these areas, rather than staying broad across everything that's trending, develops a kind of practical intelligence that shows up visibly in every interaction, every meeting, and every decision. The result is a mind that feels less cluttered and more precise. Less full, more sharp. When you stop consuming knowledge compulsively and start selecting it deliberately, something shifts. You begin to speak with more authority, decide with more confidence, and operate with the kind of grounded clarity that doesn't need external validation to feel real. Chapter 6. Saying No, the forgotten intellectual skill. There is a version of intelligence that almost never gets discussed in schools, in productivity books, or in the kind of career advice that gets passed around in professional circles. It doesn't show up on resumes. It doesn't get praised in performance reviews. It rarely gets recognized in the moment it's exercised. And yet, among the people who consistently advance, consistently protect their energy, and consistently produce work that actually matters, it is one of the most practiced and most valued mental skills they possess. It is the ability to say no, not the impulsive, reactive no that comes from frustration or avoidance, not the passive no that hides behind vague excuses and non-committal language, but the clear, deliberate, values-driven no that comes from a person who understands exactly what they are building and has made a prior decision about what deserves access to their time, their attention, and their mental energy. Most people operate under an assumption so deeply embedded it rarely gets examined. That saying yes is generous, collaborative, and professionally smart, while saying no is selfish, difficult, or career-limiting. This assumption is reinforced constantly by managers who reward availability, by social environments that equate agreeableness with likability, by a professional culture that often mistakes busyness for productivity and confuses exhaustion with effort. But here is the reality that intelligent people eventually discover, usually after paying a significant cost to learn it. Every yes you say to something that doesn't matter is simultaneously a no to something that does. Your time is not elastic. Your attention is not infinite. Your cognitive energy does not replenish instantaneously. Every commitment you accept that isn't aligned with what you're actually trying to build doesn't just consume time. It consumes the mental clarity and focused energy that your most important work requires. The person who says yes to everything doesn't become more capable. They become more fragmented. Their attention gets divided across so many commitments that none of them receive the quality of thinking they deserve. Their best work never gets done because their best thinking never gets the space it needs. And at the end of days filled with activity, they feel genuinely exhausted, not from doing meaningful work, but from the cumulative weight of everything they agreed to that didn't actually need their involvement. Meryl Streep is widely considered one of the most intelligent and strategically self-aware performers in the history of American cinema, not just because of her extraordinary talent, but because of the discipline with which she has protected the conditions that allow that talent to operate at its highest level. Throughout a career spanning 5 decades, Streep has been consistently selective in a way that seems almost counterintuitive for someone in an industry built on visibility and momentum. She has turned down roles that would have paid enormously and maintained her public profile simply because they didn't meet her internal standard for what was worth her full investment. Not because those projects were bad, but because she understood something about how creative excellence actually works. It requires not just effort, but a specific quality of focused, undivided attention that is impossible to generate when your mental energy is spread thin across commitments that don't genuinely warrant it. What makes Streep's approach particularly instructive for anyone operating in a professional environment is that her selectivity was never publicly dramatic. She didn't make announcements about what she was turning down. She didn't cultivate a reputation for being difficult or demanding. She simply, quietly, and consistently said no to what didn't meet her standard and yes to what did. The result, compounded across decades, is a body of work that stands entirely apart from her contemporaries. Not because she worked harder than everyone else, because she worked more intentionally than everyone else. Now apply this principle to the environment most people actually inhabit. The daily reality of meetings, requests, obligations, social commitments, and professional demands that accumulate without anyone explicitly planning them. Think about a typical week. How many meetings did you attend where your presence was technically required, but your contribution was marginal at best? How many emails did you respond to that didn't actually need a response from you specifically? How many conversations did you engage with that left you feeling drained rather than energized? How many commitments did you accept to colleagues, to friends, to family members? Not because they aligned with anything you were genuinely trying to accomplish, but because declining felt uncomfortable. Now think about what that same week would have looked like if you had protected even 30% of that time and mental energy for the work, the thinking, and the relationships that actually matter to you most. This is not a hypothetical exercise in idealism. It is a practical description of the difference between how mentally fragmented people operate and how mentally intelligent people operate. The distinction is not capacity. It's not talent. It's not even opportunity. It's the willingness to use the word no, clearly, calmly, and without excessive justification, as a tool for protecting the conditions under which real excellence becomes possible. For anyone who has consistently felt overlooked or undervalued in professional or social environments, this chapter carries a message that might initially feel counterintuitive. One of the most powerful things you can do to increase the weight your voice carries is to dramatically reduce the number of things you say yes to. Here's why. When you say yes to everything, you signal, not through any words, but through your behavior, that your time and attention have no particular value, that they are freely available to anyone who asks, that your default mode is accommodation. And people, consciously or not, calibrate how much they value your input based on how scarce and selective that input appears to be. The person who contributes to everything is, paradoxically, often taken less seriously than the person who contributes selectively, but with evident depth and conviction. The person whose opinion carries weight in a room is rarely the one who comments on everything. It's usually the one who speaks less frequently, but with unmistakable clarity and purpose. And that selectivity, a voice of commitment, of attention, begins with the practice of saying no to what doesn't genuinely deserve a yes. Here is the practical application. The next time you receive a request for your time, your attention, your presence, your opinion, your involvement, don't respond from the impulse to accommodate. Create a deliberate pause, the same pause you practiced in Chapter 1, and ask yourself one question. Does this support or interfere with what I am actually trying to build right now? If it supports it, say yes with full commitment. If it interferes with it, say no. And say it with the kind of simple, calm clarity that requires no elaborate justification. You don't need to apologize for having priorities. You don't need to construct a detailed explanation for why you're declining. You don't need to make the other person feel better about your boundary at the cost of undermining it. Simple, clear language is both more respectful and more effective than lengthy justification. That's not something I can take on right now. I need to focus my attention elsewhere this week. I'm going to pass on this one. Said calmly, without hostility or drama. These phrases don't damage relationships. They establish something far more valuable: the understanding that your yes, when it comes, means something, because it was chosen, not reflexively given. The long-term result of mastering this skill is profound and compounding. Less mental exhaustion, more focused energy for the work that actually matters. A growing sense of internal alignment, the feeling that how you spend your time actually reflects what you value. And perhaps most importantly for the person who has felt invisible or unheard, a gradually increasing weight and credibility to your presence, because you have trained the people around you to understand that when you show up fully, and when you speak with intent. Chapter 7. Intelligence proves itself through consistency. Understanding something is not the same as living it. This distinction, obvious when stated directly, but surprisingly easy to forget in practice, is at the heart of why so many intelligent people fail to translate their intelligence into results that others can see and respect. Most people who engage with ideas about personal development, strategic thinking, or mental performance experience a genuine moment of clarity when they encounter a principle that resonates. They feel it land. They recognize its truth. They can immediately see how applying it would improve their situation. And for a brief window, sometimes hours, sometimes days, they do apply it. They pause before reacting. They protect their attention. They filter whose opinions they absorb. They say no to a request that would have drained them. And then, quietly and without much drama, they stop. Not because the principles stopped being true, not because they forgot them, but because clarity alone, even genuine, deeply felt clarity, is not a system. And without a system, even the most intelligent insights fade back into the background noise of daily habit. This is the gap that separates the person who thinks intelligently sometimes from the person who thinks intelligently consistently. And it is in that consistency, not in any single brilliant decision or inspired moment, that the real, visible, compounding advantages of practical intelligence accumulate. The life does not reward what you understand. It rewards what you sustain. Jeff Bezos built one of the most valuable companies in human history, but the aspect of his operational philosophy that most directly applies here has nothing to do with business strategy or market timing. It has to do with how he approached the relationship between good principles and daily behavior. From the earliest days of Amazon, Bezos operated according to a concept he called Day One thinking, the discipline of approaching every decision with the same foundational clarity and long-term orientation you would bring if it were your first day, before familiarity breeds complacency, and before success breeds the assumption that what worked yesterday will work tomorrow. What made this more than a motivational phrase was the way Bezos institutionalized it. He wrote things down. He created structured processes for decision-making that didn't rely on inspiration or mood. He built systems for himself and for the company that made good thinking the default rather than the exception. He understood that intelligence, at the organizational level and at the personal level, is not primarily a matter of having smart people in the room. It's a matter of creating conditions where smart thinking happens reliably, regardless of the energy level, emotional state, or motivational temperature of any given day. This is the principle behind consistency as an intellectual practice. You don't trust your intelligence in the moment. You build structures that express your intelligence in advance, so that when the moment comes, when you're tired, stressed, pressured, or tempted by the path of least resistance, the structure carries you rather than your willpower having to. Think about what this looks like in practical terms. The person who has decided once that they will pause before reacting to provocations and has built that pause into their actual behavior through deliberate repetition doesn't have to summon willpower every time someone challenges them in a meeting. The pause has become automatic. The behavior has become identity. They don't practice it when they feel inspired to. They practice it every time because they've decided that's who they are, not what they try to do when conditions are favorable. The person who has decided once that they will protect 2 hours of their morning for their most important work and has defended that commitment consistently, declining interruptions and deflecting non-urgent requests during that window, doesn't fight a new internal battle every morning about whether to honor that commitment. The commitment has become structural. It requires no negotiation because the negotiation was settled in advance. The person who has decided once that they will only absorb opinions from people who have earned the right to influence their thinking and has practiced the quiet internal filter consistently doesn't experience the same exhausting flood of self-doubt when critics and skeptics offer their unsolicited assessments. The filter has become reflexive. It operates without effort because it has been exercised enough times to become natural. In each case, the intelligence isn't in the individual decision. The intelligence is in the system that makes the decision automatic. And building that system is an act of will that happens once, in the moment of genuine commitment, and then gets reinforced through repetition until it no longer feels like effort. This is especially important for people navigating environments where they have historically felt underestimated or overlooked. Because the temptation in those environments is to perform your intelligence, to demonstrate it loudly and visibly in moments of high stakes, to prove through individual dramatic gestures that you deserve to be taken seriously. And that approach, though understandable, almost always backfires. It comes across as insecurity dressed as confidence. It reads as someone trying to establish credibility rather than someone who already has it. The alternative, and it is a more powerful alternative, though it requires more patience, is to let your consistency establish your credibility for you. To show up with the same quality of thinking, the same calmness under pressure, the same clarity of judgment, the same disciplined selectivity, day after day, regardless of whether anyone is watching or acknowledging it. To become, through repetition, someone whose reliability is so visible and so established that it precedes you into every room you enter. That kind of credibility cannot be performed. It can only be built, and it is built through exactly the kind of unglamorous, unwitnessed, daily repetition of intelligent behavior that most people abandon the moment it stops feeling new. Here is the practical commitment this chapter asks of you. Choose 3 principles from this audiobook, not the ones that sound most impressive, but the 3 that you know, specifically and honestly, would most improve your daily life if you actually practiced them. Write them down, not in a notes app you'll never open again, on something physical, somewhere you'll see it, and then make a single decision. These are not things I will try to do when I'm motivated. These are things I do. Period. Without negotiation, without exception, without waiting for the right conditions. Pausing before you react. Protecting your attention from noise that produces nothing. Saying no to what interferes with what you're building. Filtering whose opinions you actually absorb. Learning what will genuinely improve your decisions rather than what simply sounds interesting. Repeat these decisions daily. Not because you have to revisit the logic every morning, but because repetition is how intention becomes identity. And identity, who you actually are consistently in behavior, is the only foundation from which lasting respect, genuine influence, and real confidence can be built. When you sustain good decisions, something shifts in how others experience you. You become predictable in the best possible sense, not boring or rigid, but reliable. People begin to trust your judgment because they've seen it operate consistently under varying conditions. They seek your input not because you've demanded their attention, but because your consistent clarity has made your perspective genuinely valuable to them. You stop needing to prove yourself in individual moments because the accumulated weight of your consistency has already made the case. Chapter 8. Living as someone smarter than everyone else. Let's be precise about what that phrase actually means, because it is not what most people assume when they first hear it. Being smarter than everyone else does not mean knowing more than they do. It does not mean speaking more fluently, or having a more impressive educational background, or being able to win arguments more effectively. It does not mean looking down on the people around you, or operating from a position of superiority, or treating others as obstacles to be outmaneuvered. People who confuse intelligence with those things spend their entire lives performing. And performing is exhausting, because it requires an audience, and audiences are unreliable. What it actually means to live as someone smarter than the people around you is this: you make fewer repeated mistakes. You choose more wisely when the pressure is high and the outcome is uncertain. You do not allow emotion, noise, urgency, or the expectations of others to make decisions that belong to you. You move through your life with a quality of calm, deliberate clarity that others notice but cannot always explain. And that quiet noticeability, compounding over months and years, is what creates the kind of influence, respect, and opportunity that no single impressive moment could ever manufacture. Real intelligence, the kind that changes the actual trajectory of a life, does not announce itself. It accumulates. It builds quietly in the daily decisions that no one sees, in the reactions that don't happen, in the opinions that don't get absorbed, in the commitments that don't get made, in the learning that actually gets applied. And then one day, people look at someone operating from that foundation and wonder how they got there, as if the result appeared without a process, as if the clarity was natural rather than built. It was built, every single day, in exactly the way this audiobook has described. Across the 8 chapters of this audiobook, you have encountered a complete and integrated system for practical intelligence. Not a collection of interesting ideas. A system, meaning that each element supports and reinforces the others, and together they create something greater than any individual principle could produce alone. You learned, in Chapter 1, that the pause between stimulus and response is not a sign of weakness or uncertainty. It is the precise location where practical intelligence lives. The person who can create that pause, consistently, under real pressure, when the impulse to react is strongest, is the person who retains control of outcomes that most people surrender without realizing they ever had them. Every room you enter contains people who are ready to react. The person who pauses stands apart immediately, not because they've said anything yet, but because their very stillness communicates something that words rarely can. I am not controlled by this moment. You learned, in Chapter 2, that attention is not a passive experience, something that happens to you as stimuli arrive. It is an active choice, one that most people make unconsciously and therefore make poorly. The quality of your thinking is determined not by the raw power of your intellect, but by the quality of what your intellect is actually directed toward. A brilliant mind aimed at irrelevant targets produces irrelevant results. An ordinary mind aimed with precision at what genuinely matters produces extraordinary ones. The deliberate management of attention, deciding what enters your mental space, what stays, and what gets discarded, is one of the highest leverage practices available to any person who wants to think more clearly and live more effectively. You learned, in Chapter 3, that the mind's default response to obstacles, description, complaint, the detailed narration of what went wrong and why, is not just emotionally draining. It is cognitively limiting. It trains the brain, through repetition, to see problems as things that happen to you rather than things you can act on. And a brain trained in helplessness becomes genuinely less capable of finding solutions, not because it lacks the intelligence, but because the habit of complaint has narrowed the field of what it's even looking for. The single cognitive pivot from "why is this happening to me" to "what can I adjust right now" is not a motivational trick. It is a genuine restructuring of how your brain engages with difficulty. And practiced consistently, it produces a compounding advantage that accumulates quietly but visibly over time. You learned, in Chapter 4, that the opinions you absorb are not neutral inputs. They are active forces that compete for influence in your mental model of yourself and your situation. When those opinions come from people who have earned the right to influence your thinking, through genuine experience, real consequences, and demonstrated clarity. Absorbing them makes you sharper. When they come from people who haven't earned that right, absorbing them makes you more confused, more hesitant, and less capable of trusting the judgment you've built through your own experience. The filter is not arrogance. It is the basic intellectual self-respect of a person who understands that their mind is not a public space. It is a private resource that deserves protection. You learned, in Chapter 5, that in an environment of almost unlimited information availability, the competitive advantage no longer belongs to the person who knows the most. It belongs to the person who has most precisely identified what is actually worth knowing, and has gone deep in those specific areas rather than staying broad across everything that's available. Popular knowledge gives you things to say. Useful knowledge gives you things to do. And in a world where almost everyone is consuming information compulsively without asking whether it will ever translate into action, the person who selects deliberately and learns purposefully operates with a kind of focused, applicable intelligence that broad consumption can never replicate. You learned, in Chapter 6, that the word no, used clearly, calmly, and without excessive justification, is not a social liability. It is an intellectual tool. Every yes you give to something that doesn't align with what you're building is a yes that came at the cost of something that mattered more. The person who protects their time, attention, and energy through deliberate selectivity is not being difficult or selfish. They are being precise. And that precision, expressed consistently through the willingness to decline what doesn't deserve access to their best thinking, is what creates the conditions for their actual best work to happen. You cannot do your most important thinking in a mind that is stretched thin across every obligation that presented itself. You can only do it in a mind that has been protected. And you learned, in Chapter 7, that none of the above principles produces lasting results when practiced intermittently. The intelligence that changes a life is not the intelligence that appears in dramatic moments of inspiration. It is the intelligence that shows up every day, in ordinary situations, under normal conditions, when no one is watching and nothing particularly important seems to be at stake. That daily, unremarkable, unsexy consistency is the actual mechanism through which good principles become identity, through which intention becomes character, through which the person you decided to become stops being an aspiration and starts being simply who you are. Now let's talk about what living from this foundation actually looks like in the specific environments where most people feel the gap most acutely. The workplace, the social group, the personal relationships where the feeling of being overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated has become familiar enough to feel almost normal. Because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where abstract principles either translate into real, visible change or don't. In the workplace, the person operating from practical intelligence does not try to prove their value through volume. They do not speak in every meeting to demonstrate engagement. They do not send emails at midnight to signal dedication. They do not volunteer for every project to appear indispensable. These behaviors, though common and even rewarded in some organizational cultures, are the behaviors of someone performing intelligence rather than exercising it. What they do instead is far more effective and far less exhausting. They speak less, but with unmistakable precision. When they contribute to a meeting, it is because they have something specific and genuinely useful to add, and they have taken the time to formulate it clearly before speaking, rather than thinking out loud and hoping something lands. That selectivity of voice creates a quality of presence that reactive talkers never achieve. People actually wait for their input, because they've learned that it's worth waiting for. They make decisions visibly and calmly, even under pressure, especially under pressure, because they have practiced the pause long enough that it has become automatic. When everyone else in the room is reacting to a crisis or a conflict, the person who stays grounded and clear stands out not by trying to stand out, but simply by not doing what everyone else is doing. That contrast is immediately and powerfully noticeable. They say no to things that don't deserve their best energy, and they say yes to things that do, and the people around them begin to calibrate accordingly. They stop being the default recipient of low-value tasks and begin being sought out for high-value contributions, not because they demanded a different role, but because their behavior communicated a different standard. And they do not waste their intellectual energy on the internal politics, interpersonal frictions, and status games that consume enormous amounts of time and attention in most professional environments. Not because they're naive about the existence of those dynamics, but because they understand that engaging with them at any depth is almost never worth the cost. The person who stays focused on producing genuinely excellent work, who manages their relationships with quiet respect and clear boundaries, and who refuses to be drawn into dramas that don't serve anything worth serving. That person advances in ways that confuse and frustrate the people who are still playing the game they opted out of. In social environments, for many people, the feeling of being invisible or undervalued is not primarily professional. It's personal. It's the experience of being in a group of friends where your voice doesn't carry, where your ideas get nodded at and then forgotten, where other people's contributions seem to land with a weight and resonance that yours somehow don't, despite the fact that you know your thinking is at least as sound as theirs. This experience is more common than people admit, and it has very little to do with intelligence in the traditional sense. It has to do with the specific qualities that make a person's presence felt, the qualities that cause people to lean in rather than politely tolerate. Those qualities are not loudness. They are not dominance or social aggression. They are not the willingness to talk over others or to command attention through sheer persistence. All of those approaches produce a temporary and ultimately fragile form of social visibility that requires constant maintenance and creates quiet resentment underneath apparent compliance. The qualities that produce genuine, lasting social presence are the exact qualities this audiobook has been training. Calm under pressure, because you've practiced the pause. Clarity of thinking, because you've protected your attention from noise that doesn't serve you. A grounded point of view, because you've filtered whose opinions actually deserve to shape your thinking. Selective engagement, because you've learned that speaking from genuine conviction about fewer things carries more weight than opining fluently about everything. And a visible, consistent integrity between what you say and what you do, because you've built the habit of following through on the principles you've committed to, even when no one is watching. These qualities, practiced consistently in social environments, create a form of presence that doesn't need to announce itself. People feel it. They may not be able to articulate exactly what it is, but they respond to it with more genuine attention, more authentic curiosity, more inclination to listen when you speak and to remember what you said after you've said it. This is not manipulation. It is not a social performance technique. It is the natural result of a person who has done the internal work of becoming genuinely clear, genuinely grounded, and genuinely selective, and who therefore shows up in social situations with something real to offer rather than something performed. In personal relationships, the intelligence this audiobook describes changes intimate relationships in ways that are perhaps more profound than any other domain. Because intimate relationships are where the impulse to react is strongest, where the opinions of others penetrate most deeply, where the temptation to complain is most constant, and where the consistency of character is most clearly revealed. The person who has genuinely internalized the practice of pausing before reacting brings something into their closest relationships that is almost universally valued and almost universally rare: the experience of being with someone who doesn't make situations worse, who doesn't add heat to moments that are already hot, who can be genuinely present with another person's difficulty without being controlled by it, who can hear something difficult without immediately defending, explaining, or deflecting. That quality, the quality of a person who thinks before they speak, who chooses their words from clarity rather than impulse, who brings calm into charged situations rather than amplifying the charge, is experienced by the people close to them as a form of love, as safety, as the rare and valuable feeling of being with someone who can be trusted not to make things harder than they already are. And the person who has learned to protect their attention, to filter whose opinions shape their thinking, to say no to what doesn't serve them, and to sustain the principles they've committed to, that person brings a different quality into their relationships as well. The quality of someone who knows who they are, who isn't endlessly buffeted by external noise, who has a stable enough internal foundation that they can be genuinely present with another person rather than constantly managing their own anxiety and uncertainty. That stability, visible, consistent, not dependent on external validation, is attractive in the deepest and most fundamental sense of the word. It draws people in. It inspires trust. It creates the conditions for real intimacy, because real intimacy requires two people who each have enough internal ground to stand on that they can genuinely see each other, rather than using each other as mirrors for their own unresolved questions. The final teaching. Here is what all of this comes down to, stated as simply and directly as possible. You do not need to become a different person. You do not need a personality transplant, a new set of talents, or circumstances that are more favorable than the ones you currently have. You do not need to be louder, more aggressive, more socially dominant, or more willing to self-promote. You do not need to read more books, accumulate more credentials, or find a way to be in the right rooms with the right people. What you need is to think better, consistently, starting with the next decision you make, the next conversation you have, the next moment when the impulse to react arrives before the clarity to respond has formed. Think better, and you choose better. Choose better, and your behavior changes. Your behavior changes, and the people around you respond differently. They respond differently, and the opportunities available to you shift. The opportunities shift, and the results of your life begin to reflect the quality of your thinking in ways that are visible, concrete, and permanent. This is not a promise of overnight transformation. Nothing real works that way, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something that won't hold up under actual conditions. What this is, instead, is a description of a process that works reliably, consistently, for anyone willing to practice it without waiting for perfect conditions or external permission. The gap between where you are and where you want to be is not a talent gap. For most people reading or listening to this, it never was. It is a thinking gap, and thinking gaps close through exactly the kind of deliberate, sustained, unglamorous daily practice that this audiobook has been describing from its first chapter to its last. You have now encountered every principle in the system. You know how to pause. You know how to direct your attention. You know how to pivot from complaint to action. You know how to filter the voices that deserve influence over your thinking. You know how to select knowledge that actually improves your decisions. You know how to protect your time and energy through the intelligent use of no. And you know that none of it means anything without the consistency that turns principles into identity. The only remaining question is the one that has always been the only question. What do you do next? Not tomorrow. Not when conditions are better or motivation is higher or circumstances are more favorable. Right now, in the next hour, in the next interaction, in the next moment when your intelligence gets to express itself through your behavior rather than your intentions. That moment is coming very soon. And when it arrives, you'll be ready. Not because you've been told what to do, but because you understand, genuinely and deeply, how real intelligence actually works. And when you understand that, everything else follows. If this audiobook gave you clarity, shifted something in how you think about your own intelligence, or gave you a single principle you'll actually carry into your daily life, then you already have something worth more than most people get from years of passive information consumption. You have a framework. Use it, refine it, build on it, let it compound. And if you want to go deeper into communication, decision-making, emotional intelligence, personal power, and the specific mental skills that determine who advances and who stays stuck, there is more waiting for you here. Every audiobook on this channel was built for exactly the person you're becoming. Someone who doesn't just want to understand these ideas, but to live them. The mind, trained well, changes everything. Not someday. Starting now.